Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants will be on a listen-only mode for the duration of today's conference. I will now turn the call over to Mr. Chris Cox. Thank you. You may begin.
All right. Thank you very much. Hi. My name is Chris Cox, and I'm a cybersecurity instructor here at CDSE. Today we're going to talk a little bit about cloud computing, what it is, how it's used, and the specific requirements under the Department of Defense. Before we begin, let's take a look at the navigation features of Adobe Connect. In the upper right-hand corner where that gentleman's pointing, you have the ability to expand the screen. If you get sick of looking at me and you want to look at the slides themselves, just click that one and it'll come up full screen. In the lower left-hand corner, we have our file share. You can download a copy of the notes page, the handout for this particular presentation. And then we do have a closed captioning below for 508 compliance. So I do want to give a shout out to our excellent closed captioner. I don't know how they keep up with me. I tend to talk a little fast when I get excited about a topic, but they do, and I'm grateful that they do. And then we do have notes and announcements in the lower right-hand corner, so as anything comes up, you'll be able to keep track of it. And then also directly to the right, we have a Q&A box. So if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to type it there. Or when we get to the end, we're going to save some time for some discussion. So that's a great place to bring that up so we can talk about these things that come up. We are also going to start this here in a moment with a poll to kind of get a feel for who does what, and I'll get to that in a second. But so when it comes up, just feel free to check off the boxes. In this case, you can check off as many boxes as you want to, so feel free, go nuts, and we'll be able to talk about that in real time. So let's go ahead and get started with that then, this poll coming up on your screen. And let's talk about which cloud services you do actually use, that you use in your own organization or personally. For example, do you use webmail like Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo Mail, etc., iCloud services, Amazon Web Services, MS Office 365, Dropbox, MS OneDrive, Adobe Connect, social media services like Twitter, Facebook, MySpace if you prefer, something else, or do you not use any cloud service at all? So let's see what's coming in. We have a lot of responses coming in. Thank you for that. A lot of people are using web-based email like Gmail and things like that. Some people don't. They use server-based or something on their own system, but web-based is becoming increasingly popular. A lot of storage space, and of course the security requirements are built in to the solution itself. So as long as you trust their security requirements, controls, then of course you have greater security and you may be able to implement yourself. And that's kind of a common feature on cloud services that we'll talk more about in a second here. Quite a few people using iCloud, those using your iOS devices, your iDevices, iPhone and the like. Amazon Web Services, quite a few there. It's also Amazon Web Services, or AWS, is increasingly popular in the government sector, and we'll explore why here just in a second as well, because there's a good reason for that. MS Office 365, for those of you unfamiliar, that's kind of the latest iteration, the latest model being used by Microsoft for their Office suite, for Word, Excel, PowerPoint, things like that. They tried to bring it all into the cloud. There's some benefits to that. For example, an organization can share that service across their entire organization or school for students, things like that. So it can lower the cost instead of providing individual licenses for the software installation. And allow them to access it from everywhere as well. Dropbox, very popular file sharing service, MS OneDrive. Adobe Connect, that's actually one we're using now. So actually we are using a cloud service now. In fact, as you look at what a cloud service is, it will talk a little bit more, but Adobe Connect embodies that the files are not on my personal system. They're located in that cloud. The communication is taking place across that service. And also there's other ways to share files and to share other resources there as well. And then social media services like Facebook, Twitter, whatever else the case may be, that is a cloud service as well. That's how you can share information, share files. When you upload something there, when you upload a document, or a picture, something to that effect, it comes off of your personal computer or your device, and it does go into that cloud provider. It does go into their environment where they're entrusted to the security of it, or lack thereof in some cases. And then, of course, there are a lot of other ones which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. So great start, because it really shows that we do use cloud services more often than we think. Again, like I said, it's fitting we're using Adobe Connect to talk about cloud services, since we're using cloud services to talk about cloud services. So let's dig a little bit deeper and see what it is. So specifically, a cloud service refers to any service that's made available to users from the provider server rather than Okay, sorry about that. We're back. We're saying a cloud service refers to any service that's made available to users from the provider's servers rather than from the user's own servers or system. So generally this happens across the internet, but we will look at different models a little bit later. So it's not always across the internet, but that's the most common type of cloud service. The formal definition that the DoD uses and authorized and contractors under the DoD comes from NIST Special Publication 800-145, which does add a few elements to that basic definition that we just discussed. It adds that cloud computing allows users ubiquitous, convenient, and on-demand access to a shared pool of resources. Of course, that's only applicable for certain models of cloud services, which we'll get to here now. So there are a lot of examples of cloud services, and some that we use every day. So here's just a sample you can see on your screen of some of those services. You may recognize some of them. If you're familiar with them, you can see how they meet the definition that we just went over. They allow users to access a service that they don't directly control, but one that provides something of value to them. All of these, except for Apple's iCloud service, are specifically listed as authorized cloud service providers, which is defined in the most recent Authorized DoD Cloud Services Catalog, which is an important document to know if you're considering a cloud solution. But I did want to include iCloud on this list because it's something that many of us use even if we're not aware of it. And so for those of our users that are using their iDevices, iPhone or iPad, that may be using it to access this webinar right now, when you have those backups or when you're uploading things to the iCloud service, it is going on the cloud and needs to be considered and protected in the same way. Some of you might remember the iCloud breach from a little while back in which many of the private photos of celebrities were released publicly. That was due to a security vulnerability in the password management function, which allowed it to be brute force. There's actually a proof of concept that was released by security researchers, and then unsurprisingly, that was weaponized, if you will, in order to exploit the vulnerability and to gain access to those systems. So that particular vulnerability has been closed, but of course there's always other considerations and always the possibility of something else being discovered. So the cloud does have benefits, but it also carries risk, and we need to be able to balance that as we make a decision for a solution. So the NIST definition that we discussed, it lists 5 essential characteristics of cloud computing. First, it's an on-demand self-service where the user can access that resource when they need it, sometimes within authorized boundaries. It uses broad network access, both in terms of supporting broadband technology and also allowing access from a wide variety of devices. You might be able to access it from your phone or a laptop or a desktop computer or any number of devices. It also allows for resource pooling, which can help to make sure that the client has the resources that they need where they need it. That's where multiple types of resources are pooled together to be shared amongst the different clients and the different subscribers based on their service package. It also allows for the rapid expansion when it's needed, so when you need to grow or have more capabilities. So changes can be made as requirements change. Of course, in many cases, you can also contract your capabilities as well. And finally, cloud computing allows for a measured service, which is where the provider can measure and monitor the provision of the resources. So for example, billing and resource utilization, or maybe actually even access throttling if you're using too much of their resources. So there are 3 basic types of cloud services. The first we're looking at is software as a service, which is a model in which the software itself is hosted by the provider. In this case, the software is licensed by the user, and it's often referred to as on-demand software. So it's not installed on a local system, but it's accessible across the network or across the internet or whatever the model is. So this is mostly used by an end user. This is how they access the services that they need to do their job or whatever function they're trying to complete. So it includes our familiar services like Google Docs, Gmail, Hotmail, GoToMeeting, and Microsoft Office 365, and Adobe Connect, as we're using now. So platform as a service is a little bit more complicated. and it's generally geared towards developers. In this model, the service provider provides a platform that allows the clients to develop and manage their applications remotely. So it's generally not used by the end user, but by the developers that are developing products for, ultimately, an end user. And then infrastructure as a service, that provides your virtual computer services over the internet. So in this case, the provider hosts the applications, the hardware, the storage, all the components on behalf of the client. So it's as though the computer is accessed elsewhere. Generally, it's more powerful than the user can justify the purchase in their local environment. So in that case, the provider is generally also responsible for the maintenance, the continuity planning, such as the backups, disaster recovery, things like that, in order to maintain access and continuity. So some examples of that include Google Computing Engine and Amazon Web Services as well, which are far more robust than the other categories as well. So now we've talked about the three basic types of cloud services. Again, that's software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. So let's take a closer look at the four specific categories of cloud. So basically how those are utilized and how they're accessed. So first, the one that we often think about when we talk about cloud services is a public cloud. So a public cloud is when the entire infrastructure is located on the premises of the provider, so the cloud services provider. They maintain everything, and that's accessed by multiple different individuals or organizations across the internet or across whatever infrastructure is put in place to access that. So that means that the services are generally geographically separate from the customer, unless they just happen to be nearby, but that's not by design. So the customer has really no physical control over the infrastructure itself. Public clouds generally share resources, which gives a performance benefit. You can have access to greater resources, better performance than may be available inside the organization, which justifies the outsourcing. But of course, this category of cloud is most vulnerable to attack. And sometimes that's not even by design. You may not even be the target. Of course, there's always targets of opportunity, depends on the security configuration of the provider. But if the provider hosts an organization that is the target of an attack, it's important to remember that if you're using a public cloud provider, you may inadvertently be impacted by an attack on a different client. So then we have private clouds, which use the infrastructure, which is solely used by one customer or one organization. It's not shared with others, although it's generally located remotely, which sometimes allows it to support different locations or to support disaster recovery. For case of disaster recovery, if you have some sort of resources that you need to do your day-to-day job or your task, your mission, you want it to be on a separate power source. You want it to be geographically dispersed or remote so that it's not impacted by the same event that might impact the organization itself. So a private cloud service allows for that and allows redundancy and some greater access in the event of a disaster. So the company might also choose to host the private cloud on premises if that's not a consideration, which is more important, but it does give them physical control over the infrastructure itself. A private cloud is more secure than a public cloud. So when you control the actual hardware, you can be more certain of the security posture. You can be certain of the patches that have been applied, of the physical security measures, the other things that you can't control when it's outside of your organization. So one thing to consider, of course, is that if it's geographically dispersed, if it's at a different location, you may be traveling over public internet lines, which sounds a lot like a public cloud because you're traveling over untrusted lines. And that's where your encryption of your data in transit and your tunneling comes into play, that you can protect that in transit and then get the data where it needs to go. But there is a trade-off for the security of having your cloud located in your physical space. Although the cost reduction can be minimal, if you're investing in the on-premises infrastructure. So you have to consider the overall costs, which may be a trade-off between the private and the public clouds. So we also have what's called a hybrid cloud, which is a combination of public and private cloud models. For example, a public cloud can be used to interact with customers or provide services to customers, while the private portion can help keep the data secure that you need within your organization, but the customer shouldn't have access to. So for example, if you access Google search features or Amazon or things like that, you're accessing the public portion, but you should not and generally do not have access to the private portion, which can include their billing, HR records, other things like that, which aren't customer accessible. This type of model can give the company much more flexibility and gives you more deployment options, but the cost and complexity also increases significantly as well. So, and finally, sometimes we also see a community cloud, which is a collaborative effort where the infrastructure is shared between different organizations from a different community, from a specific community with common concerns. So for example, security, compliance, or jurisdiction may be things that are taken into account to see if they have that shared mission or that shared requirement that justifies a community cloud. So it can be managed internally or it can be managed by a third party, and it can be hosted internally or external to the organization. It depends on the infrastructure and the decisions put in place by the participants. So one benefit of this type of model is that it spreads the cost over multiple different users. They share the cost, which can make it cheaper than a private cloud, but not quite as inexpensive as a public one. It's pretty common for joint ventures or shared research efforts where there's a requirement to share information quickly and effectively, but also to have those security features put in place and with cost-saving measures as well. So of course we do have to look at the pros and cons when we're talking about a cloud solution. The first benefit, and the one that's one of the most common reasons for seeking a cloud solution, is of course cost. It's often cheaper to allow a provider to host services or hardware versus making that investment themselves. And of course if you lack the expertise in-house, that saves you the cost of hiring and training an individual to take on that function. It can save time because the company doesn't need to set up or manage the service. It's already there. It's already available. And the providers can provide an uptime guarantee as well. So the customer has the ability to be assured that the service is going to be available when they need it. And that also they can expand it as required. As we talked about, it's one of the features of cloud computing is you can expand when you need it expanded. In this case, the provider is most often responsible for keeping the systems patched and updated. But agreements should be put in place in order to define those requirements, or at least that should be defined in the contract. What are their policies? What are their standards for disaster recovery? How often do they back up your data? How quickly do they respond in the event of a loss or some sort of disaster? These are all things that need to be considered when balancing against the use case and balancing against the cost to justify it. So on the other hand, using a cloud service does mean a trade-off in security and privacy. That convenience does come at a cost in terms of that. So you simply can't be sure of the security and privacy of a system if you don't physically control it. And even then, sometimes you can't as well. It's also important to keep in mind that more network traffic can result in more bandwidth costs. If you're accessing these services remotely, especially if it's bandwidth intensive, then that can increase your bandwidth use and hence costs with your ISP or whatever other provider you have in place. You also have to consider the reliability, which we talked about on the pro side, but that if the system isn't available, then you don't really have that service for that duration. That can have a significant business impact, especially if your business operations are tied into that cloud service. It may be worth considering the business benefit, cost-benefit analysis, if you will, of using a cloud provider. Because it's a perpetual cost, you're continually paying for that service until you're done using that service itself. So the long-term costs, they really might outweigh the cost of developing an internal solution. And again, tied up with security and privacy, it's important to keep in mind that you have limits on what you can control as far as the security and configuration of the system. However, there are standards that are put in place. Let's explore that here. So there's a few things to keep in mind when you're selecting a cloud service provider. The first is the requirements under the DoD Risk Management Framework, or RMF. RMF is the current DoD methodology for assessing and authorizing information systems, something we used to call certification and accreditation under DICAP and DITSCAP, but I'm dating myself there. And so there's a requirement that the cloud services not only meet those requirements as defined, but also that your organization can can complete that assessment and authorization package to the satisfaction of the authorizing official when required to do so. So there's also FedRAMP, which provides a standardized approach for acquiring cloud services. It defines the approach to the assessments, the authorization, and the continuous monitoring for all cloud services, and also requires the use of approved cloud service providers for certain organizations. Again, this is defined in the Cloud Services Catalog, which is available through the website that I have linked here, fedramp.gov. Remember that FedRAMP is actually required for those certain agencies, which is specifically for DoD agencies as well. For those contractors that have DoD contracts and that support DoD contracts that are using cloud services in the performance of that contract, there's also a requirement under the DFARS clause to use certain security controls that are defined in NIST Special Publication 800-37 and 800-53. So those are the same security controls that are drawn from in FedRAMP. So basically the security requirements are the same. So for those contractors that are using cloud services in support of a government contract to process government data, for example, and to execute that contract, it's important to work with the contracting official. It's important to work with DSS as well in order to make sure that's properly used and that the correct security controls are in place. So the only exception as far as federal agencies go is when the deployment of a cloud service is entirely within the federal facility and it's used by that one organization. So that's the exception when FedRAMP applies if you're using something that you, again, have that physical control over. And finally, we do have FedRAMP Plus, which adds specific security controls and requirements for DoD cloud services. So it kind of it adds those additional requirements in order to have a little bit more security for the cloud provider or for the cloud implementation. So it's an important takeaway is that when you're considering a cloud service, so one thing to take away, one thing to understand is that if you are considering a cloud service for your organization, just remember that there's specific requirements that are already in place, already defined, and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel when you're selecting a provider. The process and the security requirements and the controls, they've already been defined, they're already available to you, and those resources are available. Once again, you can look at fedramp.gov, you can talk to your IS rep, you can talk to your security personnel. It's important to get all that information together so you don't end up reinventing the wheel and you don't end up trying to find this information yourself when it's readily available. So for more information on the security requirements of a cloud solution, you can refer to the DoD Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide. The most current version is available through fedramp.gov, that link that we discussed earlier. So do understand that FedRAMP provides a minimum security baseline for all cloud services in the DoD, and that FedRAMP Plus gives you those additional tailored controls that are specific to the solution or the environment, so it adds to that. And of course, there's the DFARS clause that requires certain security considerations for contractors using those cloud services. That same clause, by the way, also covers for incident response and other features that's very important to be familiar with. So there may also be additional controls that have to be put in place, and that's where it's important to have those conversations. So for example, for HIPAA requirements, personal health information, personally identifiable information, privacy requirements, things like that. But again, that's already been defined and the information is readily available. Good place to start is looking at fedramp.gov and the FedRAMP policy memos that outline and amplify some of those requirements. So we do have just a few minutes. If there's any questions that have come through, we can go and address those things. So feel free in the Q&A box before we close up. Go ahead, and if you have any thoughts you want to share, anything you want to add to, any experiences that you've had that may be relevant to the rest of the community here, please do feel free to chime in. And we'll give just a few minutes for questions and comments to come through. This right here is a very good question that just came in. How should DSS review and potentially approve the use of cloud storage for cleared industry, or does DSS have a policy in place for this? Very good question. DSS, when looking at facilities and assessing facilities and on the assistance visits to the IS rep, The focus is generally on the high side, of course, for those systems under the National Industrial Security Program, or the NISP. However, the exception in this case is for those companies that deal with FOCI information, of course, the foreign-owned and controlled facilities. So in those cases, that should be defined in the ECP, an electronic communication plan, in order to make sure that information, that the correct information is being shared with the parent, the foreign company. So that is something to talk to your IS rep about if you are under the auspices of DSS. So very good question. And question about if there's any classified, any high-side cloud providers. Yes, there is. There is classified cloud provider, at least one that I'm aware of. It's called MilCloud. It's available through DISA, and it does work. It does go over SIPR. So that is at least a, or maybe the, as far as I know, the cloud services provider that can handle classified information. Once again, you get more information for that through DISA, as they are the provider for that. Very good question. Let's see. We need to be careful about customizations that can limit ability to receive upgrades from software as a service vendors. Are there any best practices available within the FedRAMP site? That's an excellent question. Yes, there is. FedRAMP does, again, give you more information about that. It does give you specific guidance. There's always a balance between security and usability. The more secure a system is, the less usable, the less user-friendly it is. There's more requirements put in place. And the more usable it is, you have a trade-off with security. So FedRAMP, when FedRAMP was being developed and implemented, there was thought into how to balance those two, just like any security model. So the important thing to remember is that as the security aspects impact usability, it's important to have that conversation with your security personnel, with the authorizing official, or whatever authority you may fall under, in order to make sure that you're properly balancing those two requirements. It's a good question. And we have time for one more question that came through. Are any of the major providers certified or recommended for contractor use like Azure or AWS, or is that covered in FedRAMP? Yes, it is covered in FedRAMP, and that is covered in the Cloud Services catalog. I would point out that Amazon Web Services, through their GovCloud, is authorized up to level 3 through 5, which does allow for a certain amount of sensitive info, not classified info in that case, but more than the traditional. Most of the other providers are levels 1 and 2, which allows for public unclassified information, or at least the public impact level, whereas AWS is at that higher level as well. So really, you pay a cost for the greater level of security, so it is a matter of what your organization actually needs. Make sure you've done that full assessment and are choosing the right provider for that. So we are out of time for any further questions, so I do appreciate you spending some time with me today. We did cover a lot in a very short period of time. I know there's a lot to take in, so there's a few resources that you can download through FedRAMP that would give you some more information. You can get the FedRAMP memo called Security Authorization of Information Systems in Cloud Computing Environments. That's a mouthful, but it's on the FedRAMP site. You'll be able to find that there. And also what's called the DoD Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide, or the Cloud Computing SRG. That is applicable both to DoD and to contractors as well, and that defines the security controls required for cloud computing. But if nothing else, do take away that there's a process in place for selecting and implementing a cloud solution in your environment, and it's designed to make it as simple as possible while ensuring a secure implementation. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to the CDSE Cybersecurity mailbox at dss.cybersecuritytraining@mail.mil. We are going to be bringing up here in a moment some poll questions, just some feedback. We do try to improve. I do try to improve and take your feedback as well. So if you have anything you want to add, anything you want to include, or anything you feel we need to do better, please do feel free to mark it here. We do read this. We do send it up to the leadership of the organization, and we do improve based on your feedback. So please do feel free to add it here. So until then, I'm Chris Cox. Thank you for joining us today.
That concludes today's call. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time.